Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well appointed basement with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Welcome to Coast AM. I'm Richard Serrett, and tonight, this morning, I'm coming to you live from my home studio in Old Thornhill, just north of Toronto. It's not been a great winter so far for outdoor skating rinks up here. I've told you about our backyard hockey rink in Thornhill. Now, it started off as a promising winter. My boys were out on the ice playing shinny with friends on Christmas Day and then on Boxing Day. And then the temperature turned warmer and the ice turned to slush. Early January, the hockey rink was now a swimming pool. Then we had a snowstorm. It got cold, but the ice was covered with several feet of snow, too heavy to shovel. And then it got warm again. Well, this week, finally, things are looking up. The temperature has dipped, and how. Today was a low of minus 12 Celsius, and the rest of the week, well, it's just going to get colder and colder. Listen to this forecast: minus 33 tomorrow, minus 15 on Tuesday, minus 17 Wednesday, minus 25 on Friday and Saturday. And last night, we hooked a garden hose up to the laundry sink in the basement, just down the hall from where I'm sitting, ran the hose outside, hooked it up to a device. It's like a mini handheld Zamboni, and the boys flooded the rink to smooth it out, and it was like glass. So they were out there again tonight playing under the lights and having a great time, and I love the sound of the puck hitting the boards. They've been trying to coax me out, but I got to tell you, playing hockey in minus 12, 13, 17, or minus 25, I may just have to drag out the thermal underwear, grit my teeth, and bear it. All right, we've got a fun show for you tonight. One of my favorite topics right off the top, rock and roll mysteries. And the rock and roll detective Jim Berkenstadt is here in the first half to discuss secrets, myths, legends, hoaxes, conspiracies, and the wildly inexplicable events that are such an intriguing part of rock and roll history. We're going to travel back to the 1950s to uncover who really discovered Elvis Presley, revisit a time in the 60s when a famous folk troubadour tried to form a supergroup with members of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and we'll learn the origin behind big-name artists using pseudonyms to mask their true identities. And time permitting, we'll go behind the scenes of CIA intrigue in Jamaica 1976 to discover whether the spy agency tried to influence an election and arrange for the assassination of reggae superstar Bob Marley. And we'll discover whether the Beach Boys actually stole a song and the copyright from psychotic cult leader Charles Manson and kept all the royalties. Coming up in the second half, a fan favorite, the legend of Atlantis. Now, one could argue Atlantis has been pretty much beaten to death, or been beaten to death, and either proving it existed at all, and if it did, nailing down its location has proven to be kind of an inscrutable riddle, one unlikely ever to be solved. But my guest in hours 3 and 4 is very confident he has just done that. He has solved at long last and provided pretty much ironclad evidence that not only did the city/continent/kingdom of Atlantis indeed exist, he believes he's finally proven its location. David Edward is a U.S. Army veteran, a counterterrorism expert, engineer, and a physical historian, and building on the work of another veteran, James Corsetti and David Stig-Hansen, who identified Atlantis' actual location back in 2018, and then adding or applying a more rigorous methodology to their work, as well as his understanding of the peer review process. So again, David is confident he's proven it, and his compelling case is laid out in his book, Atlantis Solved, the Final Definitive Proof. The Rock and Roll Detective is next. Welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler. Hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come warm yourself by the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. I'm Richard Serrett, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Why don't you stay a while? Dubbed the rock and roll detective, Jim Berkenstadt has spent a lifetime researching, writing, and consulting in pop music history. His books on the unreleased recordings of the Beatles, Black Market Beatles, and the making of Nirvana's seminal album Nevermind are critically acclaimed. Berkenstadt has served as a consultant to the Beatles, George Harrison, the Traveling Wilburys, the band Garbage, and many international record labels. He's currently the co-star of two pop culture TV series on the Reels channel, Celebrity Legacies and Celebrity Damage Control. As founder of Rock and Roll Detective, Jim's firm offers a number of specialized and confidential services to music artists, record labels, music download sites, TV and film productions, auction houses, and museums. His book, The Beatle Who Vanished, has been optioned for a motion picture, and his latest is Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. Jim Berkenstadt, welcome back to Coast. How are you?
Hey, Richard, thank you so much for having me on. I'm doing great, and it's great to be back on.
I know this isn't the first time you've heard it, maybe the thousandth time you've heard it, but you must have the coolest job on the planet. How did you get into this?
That is a common question. Well, I think as a kid, when other guys were collecting baseball cards and memorizing statistics on the back of the cards, I was collecting 45s and LPs as I could afford them. And I wanted to know who produced the song, who was the engineer. I wanted to know more about the musicians, the artists, and what was their individual contribution to the finished product. And the Beatles really hit in 1964 here in America with the Ed Sullivan Show. That drew me really first and foremost to the Beatles. From that point on, I wanted to know who were the artists that influenced the Beatles. And then once the Beatles broke up, although I continued to follow them individually, I got more into wanting to know more about various classic rock artists. So it started as a passion, and it continued. And in the 90s, I decided to reach out to George Harrison and volunteer my historical knowledge, et cetera. And he took me up on it, and I was very fortunate to work with him for the last few years of his life. And then that led to the Beatles and many other things as well.
Well, I don't know if you can divulge this, and I don't obviously want you to betray any confidences, but can you tell me why you were hired by the late George Harrison to consult for him?
Yeah, I think it would be okay to say originally he was putting together a new version of All Things Must Pass, and it did come out while he was still alive. Now, since then, it came out again, I think, a year ago, with even more information, more music and such on it, and a fancier box set. But when he started, I said, hey, we bought this thing on vinyl, we bought it on cassettes, we bought it on 8-tracks. Then CDs came along, we bought your album on CDs, and I said, I think the fans want some extra tracks. I think, the fact that you remaster something or remix something isn't necessarily enough for someone who already has the albums. And so if you want to get them to buy it again, I'm suggesting you release some bonus tracks. So he did do that, and I was helpful in digging up some things for that, and then it just sort of went on from there. We worked on some other things, and then I started working on Beatle projects such as album, reissues of albums, documentary films, and even the Cirque du Soleil Love Show in Vegas.
Oh, yes. I remember when the reissue of All Things Must Pass came out, and I remember an interview he did at the time. He wasn't really pleased with the original. He said too much reverb, so he wanted to redo it.
Yeah. That's interesting because it's true because, Phil Spector and his famous Wall of Sound, he produced that album with George. And, he wanted 6 drummers and 4 lead guitarists and all that kind of thing on the song. And, at the time, it sounded really cool to us. We didn't know any better. We were just fans growing up. But I think that when George went to listen to it in a more modern era, that he thought it just sounded a little too cluttered, maybe musically. And I think that he would be very proud of what Danny Harrison and his crew, his group did on the most recent box set. Because I think they've really pulled out George's voice and distinguished the instruments, and it's just not as muddy as I think the original one sounds, if you were to put that on today.
Sticking with Harrison and a super group, the Traveling Wilburys. It's an amazing story, really filled with synchronicities of how that band, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Roy Orbison, and I guess Jim Keltner on drums, how they all came together almost by accident. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, it's really a really unique story. George and Jeff Lynne were working on George's Cloud 9 album at the time, and it just so happened that Bob Dylan and Tom Petty were touring together. I know that George had known Bob Dylan for a long time. I don't know that he really knew Tom Petty yet. But they decided to go, backstage, go to the concert, etc. So the 4 of them were together in England while Dylan and Petty were touring. Then once Cloud 9 was finished, in those days, because, we were still dealing with physical albums, CDs and things, there was always a marketing need to create some B-sides, or by B-sides for your listeners, I mean songs that weren't originally written and recorded on the album itself, Cloud 9. So they needed a couple extra songs. They oftentimes would also ask for, hey, can you give us an extended mix, because then it might get some playtime in dance clubs. So Jeff Lynne and George Harrison were now in L.A. They were out to dinner. They brought Roy Orbison to dinner because Roy and Jeff were working on a project for Roy Orbison. So the 3 of them were having dinner, and George said, I've got to do this B-side. Jeff, why don't we just get a studio tomorrow, and I'll just bang it out. I'll write it, and we'll record it, and that's that. And Jeff said, well, George, you can't just, this is L.A., you can't just get a studio the next day. It takes a while, and you have to find the right one, get the right sound, etc. So George said, all right, well, Bob Dylan, he's got a studio in his garage. So George calls him up, and, the odds of getting Bob Dylan at home, a man who just tours almost every day of the year.
Yeah. Never-ending tour.
Yeah, never-ending tour, as he's called it. So the odds of him catching Bob Dylan at home were like 1 in a million. Of course, Bob answers the phone. He says, sure, come on over. And when George was on his way, actually, back at the dinner, Roy Orbison says, hey, would you mind if I came and tagged along? And George and Jeff were like, sure, that'd be great. And so now they're all going to head to Bob's house, but George had lent a guitar to Tom Petty at that point, so he swung by Tom Petty's house to pick up the guitar. And Tom said, what are you doing today? And he said, Jeff and I and Roy Orbison and Bob Dylan are going to Bob's garage, and I got to bang out a B-side. I got to create a B-side and record it. And Tom said, good, I was wondering what I was going to do today. So Tom Petty heads over as well.
Invited himself.
Yeah, these 5 guys, and they're like, well, George, what's the song going to be? What's it about? And he looks over and he sees a guitar box in the corner of the garage, and it says on it, handle with care, as many, instrument boxes do. And he goes, it's called Handle with Care. So there you go. And they just started, writing it. together, and then George realized, hey, I've got all these great singers here too. Why don't I give each one a part in the song? But I think really George and Jeff thought, hey, here it is. Here's this kind of group that we hadn't even imagined, but wanted to form a group, and here we all are. And of course, they're all friends, and so it just became a great idea. And then George really took over, trying to make it the most pleasant, easy experience for everyone, and also to come up with all the, that he and some of his friends came up with some very funny origins on the mythology and backstory of the Wilburys, which I go into in great detail in the book, Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed.
Did they ever think about touring? Of course, they never did, and Roy Orbison died, I guess, about a year later, but did they ever think about touring?
They did. In fact, I think I go into that a little bit in the book. One thought was to take a train and go from city to city via the train. Another thought, George, and I think this was just, again, George's sense of humor coming out. He said, I think we should maybe get an aircraft carrier and go to different countries and dock and just play from up on top of the aircraft carrier. And in each city we land in, we'll get some big corporate company that wants to put a banner on our aircraft carrier, and then that'll help pay for all the costs involved in touring. So, despite the humor there, they did talk about it. And I just think that with all of them having such busy independent schedules, that it was kind of difficult, especially because George wanted to set this up too, so that after the Wilburys album came out, each of them could also then do their own solo record to sort of capitalize on that. So actually, Bob Dylan did that, and Tom Petty did that, Jeff Lynne did that, Roy Orbison did that. And so they all, needed to kind of do some concerts and do some touring. And so, things just got busy. I think that perhaps the person most hesitant to tour would be George, of all of them. However, he did tour live in Japan in, I think, 1991 or 2. So he got a taste of it there. It was just Japan, and Eric Clapton and his band were very helpful. But for whatever reason, it just never came together. It wasn't that anyone said, no, we're not going to do it. It's just same reason they only made 2 albums and didn't make a third one, really, is because they always wanted to, but never got around to it.
Just have about a minute and a half, Jim, before the break. But I always imagine George Harrison, and I've heard this about him, that, he didn't suffer fools gladly. What was he like?
Well, I don't think it's for me to go into his, personal life. I'll just say that I think he's a wonderful person. He was spiritual. He shared that with the world in his music. He was very funny. He certainly wasn't the quiet Beatle. He spoke up. So just a great guy. That's about all I'm willing to say.
Did he wander around with his ukulele?
He did. He wandered around in his gardens. He wandered around in his home. He absolutely loved ukulele, and I think as a result of that, when I at some point went to Hawaii, I had to get a ukulele, and I love it. There's something about the tone. It's a very happy instrument. It's easy for anybody to pick up and play.
All right. Well, that certainly was a tremendous supergroup. When we come back, we'll talk about sort of maybe the year that kind of kicked off the whole idea of the supergroup. 1969 was kind of an interesting vibe happening that year. Jim Berkenstadt will be here to tell us all about it, the rock and roll detective. Welcome back. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Syrett, S-Y, because I love you, R-E-T-T. Get on up to the highlight carousel on coasttocoastam.com. There's a terrific story there about strange top secret programs. And over the years, the U.S. government, military, and CIA crafted a number of top secret plans and projects, many of which have now been declassified. Here's a couple of the more curious one called Project 1794. This clandestine program sought to create flying saucer-style ships to shoot down Soviet bombers. Another one called Operation Washtub. During the Cold War, the FBI was concerned about a potential invasion of Alaska by the Soviets. So in 1950, Operation Washtub began with the training of 89 ordinary Alaskan citizens. They were taught decoding and espionage tactics so they might spy on the enemy should an actual invasion take place. There's another one called Acoustic Kitty. If you want the whole list of these formerly top secret projects, again, head on up to the highlight carousel at coasttocoastam.com. And the list is compiled by Elizabeth Peterson and Denise Chow, and it's published on Live Science. Back to more of my conversation with the rock and roll detective, Jim Berkenstadt, when Coast to Coast continues right after these. And we are back with Jim Berkenstadt, the rock and roll detective, the author of Black Market Beatles, Nevermind Nirvana, The Beatle Who Vanished, and the latest Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. We were talking before the break about the Traveling Wilburys, just a tremendous supergroup, as we now call them. But 1969 seemed to have been the year that sort of kicked off the whole idea of supergroups. We had Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and of course we just lost David Crosby. There was Blind Faith with Eric Clapton from Cream and Stevie Winwood from Traffic. What was it about 69 that sort of launched this whole idea of supergroups?
Well, I think, Richard, that a lot of these bands, had toured together or met each other in the clubs at night, or had even met them, like, oh, we're recording in Studio 2 and these guys are in Studio 3, and you get out and you talk to each other. I think that over time, these friendships developed between band members with other bands. And finally in 69, I think these people decided, hey, we had that fun time at so-and-so's house where we were jamming together or we were singing together. Why don't we consider a new combination, even if it was temporary or permanent? Let's create they didn't call it supergroups. That's something that sort of came into the vernacular by rock journalists. But it was more like, hey, let's just form a group of friends. And it's exactly, what happened with the Traveling Wilburys, only back in 69, it was something that record labels, studios, and attorneys hadn't planned for and didn't want to do. Like, record labels didn't want to loan out Paul McCartney to another label because that felt to them like, oh, we're going to lose some revenue here because we're letting him play on someone else's album. They're going to buy that album instead of this album that we're putting out. So there was a lot of that exclusivity. There weren't really legal manners that had been created in order for this to happen. But it happened anyway, and most of the time it happened when people had broken up from their other groups and were now free to, form a group on their own. So it's just timing, things, and jamming together, that sort of thing. Like Jimi Hendrix jammed with Traffic, and there were rock stars jamming with blues artists, that sort of thing. B.B. King and other rock stars, recorded with him in London. So the time was right.
So that brings us to a chapter in Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. It has to do with a band, a super group that was reviewed in Rolling Stone magazine called the Masked Marauders. Tell me about the Masked Marauders. Who were they?
Well, it was interesting because, again, this story, at the time, Rolling Stone magazine was sort of the official Bible of all rock and roll news. And so people believed in it. They felt that whatever they learned there was great news because, they had reporters going out on tour with artists and things. And all of a sudden, in the fall of '69, there came this record review about a group called the Masked Marauders. And allegedly, people were saying, is it possible the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and the Rolling Stones have recorded the most mind-blowing supergroup album yet, called the Masked Marauders? And what's interesting to me, I'm always interested in these different conspiracies and how they start and why they start. But even more interesting nowadays, when something goes viral, it's because of the internet, because of cell phones, etc. And stories go viral, whether they're true or conspiracy or myths. They go viral in seconds around the world. That's how quickly it goes. But at the time, this was a pre-viral age, 1969, and for some younger people, it's hard to imagine no internet, no Google, no 52 different news outlets on your phone. So this story came out, and then people who got Rolling Stones started going to school and saying, hey, have you heard about this? So there was a word-of-mouth campaign. Can you believe it? Where can we find this album? Kids started going to record stores asking about the Masked Marauders album, and the record stores didn't know anything about it, so they then started calling Rolling Stone. And the manager of the Beatles at the time and the Rolling Stones, and et cetera, all started also calling Rolling Stone. And I had the good fortune of interviewing Jan Wenner, who was the founding publisher of Rolling Stone, and he just thought it was the greatest thing in the world, all the attention. But, it turned out that this was really just sort of a joke by the writer at the time, and he wrote under the pseudonym of T.M. Christian. And that stood for The Magic Christian, which was a movie out at the time with Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr. And it was really just to make fun or poke fun at the whole supergroup idea. A lot of these Rolling Stone writers thought that supergroups were not a cool idea. But I think a lot of fans thought it was a great idea. So, they wanted to believe it. And I wanted to know more about it. I also interviewed Glyn Johns, who had produced the Beatles and the Stones and Led Zeppelin and others. And Al Cooper had been named. Al Cooper had played with Bob Dylan, and he had been named as the producer in this article. So I wanted to know what he had to say, because at the time, when the New York Times was looking into this and wrote a story, they interviewed him and said, so did you go up to Canada, north of you, I believe, Richard, and did you go up there and secretly produce Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and the Stones? And he just said, no comment. Well, if you say no comment like that to a story that everybody wants to know about, they figure then it must be true. So
I can either confirm or deny. Yes.
Right. So there are a lot of really fun stories to it, and I don't want to give them all away, but I'll just say that I think there was actually some reality in this, joke of a review, and then I also talk about once it came out, once they realized how popular it was, they actually formed a group of people to record an album. And I talk about how that album was made and how it does, if you are able to get a hold of it, it does sound a lot like Bob Dylan singing on one and Mick Jagger on another. But there's some great humor to that chapter, and a lot of little mysterious stories about the the Masked Marauders. Were they a super group or merely a masquerade?
You mentioned, 1969, pre-internet, and how, it's amazing how just word of mouth and how these rumors and hoaxes got started, which brings us, of course, to, I mean, you can't do a show about rock and roll mysteries without talking about the whole Paul is dead mystery.
Right.
Supposedly died in his car crash in November of 1966 and then replaced by a double. But the idea that just like took off, a phone call to a DJ in Detroit or one in New York City. And from there, I mean, I don't believe that, they managed to find someone even arguably more talented than the original Paul McCartney, who also was a left-handed bass player. But I mean, just kind of
and who went on to write and record like 50 more solo albums after they broke up.
Yes. So, but just from a sociological standpoint, it's interesting.
Exactly. And speaking of that, I spoke to a sociology Dr. Candy Leonard about it, and I was fascinated by how these conspiracies start and why. And what's really interesting is, there have to be some couple of things that make sense to people, and then they somehow put this all together. Or when something bad happens, like someone dies, a famous star, it's like, oh, well, that he couldn't have just died of an illness, and they can't cope with it, so they have to come up with a bigger explanation, that which we might deal with if we talk about the Bob Marley chapter. But back to Paul, what's interesting again is this mystery story has been brought back from the dead, so to speak. In early 2000, Avril Lavigne was supposed to have died and been replaced by a lookalike, sound-alike person. So, and that was now in a time where people were on the internet, and so it has spread around. But what's really funny is when I happened to get to meet Paul and Linda McCartney in 1976 at a Wings concert in Chicago. We just happened to be sitting right down next to the steps in the orchestra pit by where his piano was, and they took a break in the middle of the show, and my buddy and I both talked to Paul and Linda, but at one point I said to Linda, "So, Linda, what's it like living with a fake Paul McCartney because the real one died? Like, how did you deal with that change in boyfriends," or something like that? And she just thought that was hysterical, because obviously I was joking about it, and she just, thought the whole thing was quite hilarious. I asked the guy who's one of these international autograph experts if he could compare Paul's autograph before the alleged 1966 accident and after. And, he showed me some examples because he has them from every year of the Beatles and in their solo years. And, virtually identical. So, I mean, that's almost like a fingerprint. So I've seen people try to copy Beatle autographs, but you can see, if you understand what the real one looks like, you can see some obvious mistakes. So there's another example for people who think he's dead that proves that he is still alive and happily alive and well.
Our Gary Patterson was a good friend of mine, and we would be on the phone, and he could talk forever about all of the clues on Sgt. Pepper. You hold the straight edge of the mirror up to it, and I mean, he didn't believe that, but he was fascinated by the clues.
He wrote a great book on the topic.
Yeah, I think one of the definitive books, The Walrus, was Paul. And then coincidentally, our Gary Patterson, actually, he passed away on the 50th anniversary, the very day that Sgt. Pepper was released, I think in the UK, May 26, 67, 50 years to the day. But is there any credence to the argument that the Beatles planted some of those clues as a marketing ploy in the lyrics and so forth?
Yeah, in my opinion, I don't think so. I actually don't think they said, "Hey, let's come up with this hoax idea." But from what I understand, and from listening to many bootlegs, from reading Mark Lewison's great book about their recording sessions, they did like to put little funny things into the mix. And, people can read about them, but you could probably just find a blog online that goes over all of them. But, they put Frere Jacques in the singing chorus background of Paperback Writer, just as one little example. So they liked to play around. Once, they felt comfortable in the studio, they liked putting in little jokes and things. So I really, and someone will say, oh, well, John says I buried Paul at the end of Strawberry Fields Forever, but I think John said it was either cranberry sauce or I'm very bored or something like that. But again, whether John says it or not, if you listen to that recording forever, you just can't tell. And even if he said I buried Paul, I mean, they were like brothers. They sometimes, their jokes got a little harsh, just as any brothers would. And I buried Paul would be something more related to their relationship than a clue, in my opinion.
All right, we're going to roll into a break here at the top of the hour. But before we do, got to ask you, now be honest, how many record needles did you ruin playing some of those songs backwards?
Well, I ruined 2, and then my dad said, I'm not buying you another record needle, so stop doing that. Because I know there was some stuff on White Album that sounded like Paul is dead, miss him, miss him, miss him. And I just had to keep doing it over and over, and he finally said, these things are not cheap, so stop doing that.
All right. We'll pick up on our conversation on the other side. The hunt is on for the individual who captured this image of a strange object in the skies over Scotland 30 years ago. Back on August 4th, 1990, 2 young chefs had been walking in the Cairngorms National Park near Perth when they spotted a strange diamond-shaped object in the sky nearby. Terrified, the men hid behind some bushes to observe the mysterious craft. A short time later, they heard the sound of an RAF jet approaching. The plane seemed to change course and circle the UFO for a time before returning to its original course. Keen to take a photograph, one of the men aimed their camera at the sky and took a few snaps. A few seconds later, the object flew upwards into the heavens and was gone. Convinced that they had seen a UFO, the men passed their best photograph along to a local newspaper. However, it was promptly handed over to the Ministry of Defense and was never published. And you can read the rest of this story in the news section up at coasttocoastam.com. Back to more of my conversation with Jim Berkenstadt, the rock and roll detective, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Jim Berkenstadt stays with us, the rock and roll detective. We were talking about supergroups in 1969 and the whole Paul is dead rumor that got started in 1969. And of course, I mean, what a weird year that was. The other big horrible thing that happened in 1969 were the Charlie Manson, the murderous rampage of the Manson family. And I know you cover this in the book, Dennis Wilson, and this encounter he has with 2 girls from the Manson family, just again seems so random and serendipitous in a bad way. He picks up these 2 hitchhikers that end up being part of the Manson family, and from there it just kind of goes awry. Tell me about it.
Well, it's that was again, 69 was a strange year, but he actually in 68, that's when Dennis Wilson picked up a couple of girls hitchhiking, and those girls were already part of Manson's family, as he called his cult, and he was, he had learned guitar in prison. He had been out for about a year. He started in San Francisco and then started to move down to L.A. One of the prisoners there in the prison had given him a contact at a record label and so he actually got a demo session with some record company, a smaller company at the time, and his thought was, and I'm not inside Manson's head, but he actually has talked a lot through the years, both before, during, and after the murders, and he talked about the idea of using his music to spread the word, or in my thinking, to basically brainwash, runaway, confused girls to join his cult. And so one of the things he thought of after he didn't really pass that audition was, well, maybe I can try to find a rock producer or a rock star who can get me in and I can get a record deal. And again, remember, you couldn't go on TikTok and play your songs and suddenly become a superstar. Or I think it was Justin Bieber who did that on YouTube and became a superstar. There was really no other way than to get in through the heavily locked doors of record labels, and then they would put your records out if they deemed them good enough, and they probably wouldn't sign you if they didn't think that. And you'd be on the radio, and people would, go to record stores and buy your records. So he thought, well, that's a great way to get out the word. And so these gals were put out there in certain areas to try and pick someone up. And Dennis Wilson had separated from his wife. He was getting a divorce. He was young, single, wealthy, and very good looking. The only beach boy who could actually surf. He really represented that image of the Beach Boys. And he picked them up. He brought them back to his house. They hung out. And then he said, I have to go to a recording session. And he went to a Beach Boys recording session. When he came back late in the evening, it wasn't just two girls sitting there that he had said, you can help yourself and hang out while I'm gone. It was Charles Manson was outside and welcomed Dennis into his own home. Talk about creepy. And then inside the home, Charles Manson had moved in, not just himself, but himself and all these girls. And so really, Dennis Wilson was was somewhat naive and was easily convinced to party. And, these are all these cute little young girls and stuff. So he kind of fell under Manson's spell, first using Manson's cult girls and things. But then Manson, like I said earlier, wanted a record deal. And what did Dennis Wilson, what were his needs? Well, at the time, the Beach Boys were kind of in a mess because Brian Wilson, the principal songwriter and producer, was having mental health issues. He was laying in bed a lot. He was taking LSD. He just wasn't up to snuff to, produce another big hit record. So all the other Beach Boys felt, well, we all have to pitch in and write some songs. And so being the drummer, as Dennis was, it's not easy to write a song on a drum kit. And
No.
You just don't see that every day. So he needed a little help. And when Charles Manson started making up words out of thin air and playing, 3 and 4 chords on the guitar, all of a sudden there was something about it that interested him. So he asked his friend Greg Jacobson to go to a studio and record Charles Manson in the studio. And so it was just Manson trying to get a little step closer and get a foot in the door of the record industry.
And how close did Manson get to the rest? I don't mean in terms of a relationship, but just in proximity. Was he actually in the same room with the other, like Mike Love and Al Jardine and Brian Wilson? Did they see him perform?
There's been a lot of rumors about that. First of all, this demo session was just Greg Jacobson and Manson, and it was so that Dennis could hear some of his songs on tape and see if there was one that might interest him. And turns out there was. We can go into that. But later, after their relationship had developed further and Dennis had liked one of these songs and wanted to do more with him, he wanted to sign Charles Manson to the Beach Boys record label, Brothers Records, I think it was called. So he actually brought Manson over to their recording studio, which was in Brian Wilson's basement. But although there have been many, many rumors about Manson recording with various members of the Beach Boys, it never happened. And I interviewed Stephen Desper, who was the main sort of house engineer there. And he was very emphatic. He said, I'm the only one that ever recorded Charles Manson while he was there. He pulled a knife on me. He was a little edgy in the studio, but he said, by then the other members of the band had met him somewhere, probably at Dennis's house, and he said they just didn't get a good vibe off of Charles Manson, so they were not going to be around at all.
But they did record one of his songs, right? Never Learn Not to Love.
Yeah, so what happened was I decided that I wanted to take a new angle and solve a mystery about the Beach Boys and Charles Manson. And in order to see whether someone has stolen a song involves first finding out, well, what are the facts of the transaction if a transaction happened. Then you must apply the facts of the case to the law, the copyright law, and then make a legal determination. So there's only one person left alive who witnessed the alleged transaction between Charles Manson and Dennis Wilson. The two of them have died. But when I discovered that Greg Jacobson was still alive and was in the room when they discussed a song by Manson called Cease to Exist that was on the demo tape that Dennis paid for, and that was something Dennis wanted, I had to try to find this person, and I had to, and then I wanted to interview him. And interestingly, I couldn't find him very easily after many pages of Googling. And so finally I was about to give up when I saw a small little note that said that Greg Jacobson had done something with Taylor Hawkins, who is now the late drummer of the Foo Fighters. And Butch Vig, who produced Nirvana, Foo Fighters, and many others, is a good friend of mine. And in fact, Butch Vig wrote the foreword for this book, Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. And I called Butch and said, you know Taylor Hawkins, can you call him up and see if he has Greg Jacobson's contact information? Because I can't solve this mystery about the Beach Boys allegedly stealing a song unless I talk to him. So 5 minutes later, Butch called back and said, Taylor Hawkins said, good luck, and here's his phone number. I was then able to talk to Greg and get the actual details of the transaction. And what's interesting is over the years, this theory came up that the Beach Boys stole the song because the song that the Beach Boys did sounded just like the song that Manson wrote, but with a few differences. So I don't want to give the whole story away to your listeners, but I'll just say that Jacobson had a great memory, not just of that occasion, but many other occasions with Manson and with Dennis Wilson. He didn't have any interest in the outcome of this discussion. He merely wanted to set the record straight. And he gave me a great body of facts, which I was also a copyright trademark attorney, but I wanted to go to today's, best attorneys, and I even went to a federal judge who's an expert in the area and sat down with them and reviewed the facts, and then that was how I was able to solve that. And then I took that a little further because after Charlie got mad and started to get angrier and was making plans for Helter Skelter and all these things, over time he blamed both Greg Jacobson and Dennis Wilson for not helping him enough in his career. And so I also dealt with that because there are these crazy internet headlines that say things like Dennis Wilson caused Manson, or the Beach Boys are at fault. And so there's been this cloud over their heads. They've never really discussed this song. So I really wanted to dig into that and then also explain whether or not really Manson was blaming them for real or whether he was using it as a cover for his own crazy thoughts.
When the Manson family were sent to 10,050 Cielo Drive and, obviously killed Roman Polanski's Tate, Sharon Tate, was Manson thinking that producer Terry Melcher was still there? Because he did live at that house at one time.
Right. Well, from all the research I did, he knew that Terry Melcher had lived there. He had been there once where Melcher was dropped off one evening when they all went out together, Melcher, Dennis Wilson, and Charles Manson, and I think Greg Jacobson. But when Melcher, after the Beach Boys didn't want to have anything more to do with Charles Manson, then Manson turned to Terry Melcher, who was the son of Doris Day, but a very great producer from that time period. And he had produced songs by the Byrds and Paul Revere and the Raiders, just off the top of my head, and was very well respected. And so he got roped into going down to Spahn Ranch and listening to Manson. And according to his sworn testimony, which I found from the trial, he said, I had to let him down easy. I didn't think that Charlie was really ready to be signed to a record label. And that was also what Stephen Desper thought, the engineer for the Beach Boys. He had some interesting things. They just didn't think he was ready. And so oftentimes when a producer doesn't think someone is right for them or for a record label, they'll say something like, yeah, I just don't think it's the right type of thing of what we're looking for. In other words, they let the person down easy. So he stated this at the trial, that was their discussion. And then he saw that Manson had all these very hungry, skinny girls around, and he thought, geez, they're not looking like they're eating very well. So he handed Manson $200 in front of these gals. And Manson, after he left, Manson turned around and told all of his followers, I got a record deal with Terry Melcher, and he just gave me an advance. Well, as we all know, record deals aren't done with a handshake. They're done with big, long, convoluted contracts that go on for many pages, and advances, even in the 60s, would have been at least, say, $10,000 to $20,000 for Manson, and it wouldn't have been $200 cash. But clearly, Charlie didn't want to look like he had failed in front of his family, so he made that up. So then he continued to bug Terry Melcher over time. Greg Jacobson continued to help try to get Manson recorded and get some demo tapes out. I think from the research I did, it appears that Manson knew Terry Melcher had moved out of that house. And I think that when the murders took place, that the reason that house was targeted was because Manson wanted to send a message to basically terrify Terry Melcher. Like, I could have found you, but I just found the people that were at the house you used to live at. To me, it was sort of a threatening, awful thing to do. Well, everything Manson did was awful, I think we could say.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly changed the music business and Hollywood, the whole mood, the whole vibe, the 1960s, the whole ethos came crashing down. We're going to head into a break here at the top of the hour. When we come back, I want to talk about another chapter in the book, and that has to do with Bob Marley, reggae superstar, and the attempt on his life in 1976, and these theories that the CIA were somehow involved in trying to take Bob Marley out. Jim Berkenstadt stays with us. The rock and roll detective here is Audrey Hepburn taking us into the break. My favorite version of Moon River, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Say hello on Twitter. A Chester hotel room housing a creepy doll is said to be so haunted that guests must sign a disclaimer before they can enter. The Grace doll resides in a special glass case in room 8 of Ye Old King's Head on Lower Bridge Street, with only experienced paranormal investigators able to get anywhere near it. And even those brave souls must first sign a disclaimer. You can read more about this story, and that is in the news section up at coasttocoastam.com. All right, we'll get back to my conversation with the rock and roll detective, Jim Berkenstadt. We'll talk about Bob Marley and his, the assassination attempt made against him back in 1976, plus your calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. Jim Berkenstadt is the rock and roll detective. Mysteries in the Music, case closed. The Beatle Who Vanished, which has been optioned for a movie, so look for that on the big screen, perhaps sometime soon. Nevermind Nirvana and Black Market Beatles. So, Jim, before the break, I was gonna get you to tell me about Bob Marley. 2 days before this big concert in Kingston, Jamaica, the Smile Jamaica concert, Bob Marley and the Wailers. They're rehearsing at his home, and gunmen descend on his house, spray the place with bullets. Bob Marley is struck in the arm. I think his manager was struck like 5 times, somehow miraculously survived. His wife, Rita, was shot. I think she got hit in the head, but she survived, obviously. Right. Rumors persist that the CIA was involved. What do you think?
Well, it was really fun to research and write this chapter because there's so many interesting ingredients that make up this mystery/conspiracy. You know, you have international countries involved. You have intrigue going on in Jamaica. You have rock and roll with Bob Marley, or reggae, I should say. There's just so many great things to this. So I first found that U.S. corporations were digging up most of the island of Jamaica to mine it for bauxite. This is an ore that's used to manufacture aluminum. And back in the 70s, aluminum was a big product, and it was being used in a lot of construction. And this was a very inexpensive way for these big multinationals to get that product. However, Jamaica had gotten a new prime minister at that time. He was moving towards socialism, which really scared our government because we still remembered the Russians putting missiles on Cuba, pointing them at our country, and we were still in a Cold War with Russia. And so we didn't like the fact that the Jamaican government was turning socialist. We didn't like that their prime minister was talking to Castro in Cuba. Henry Kissinger, our Secretary of State, went over there and tried to basically offer him a bunch of money for different programs if he would just let us go back to digging up bauxite and other things. And the prime minister said, nope. So next thing you know, we had a diplomatic office down there of 2 people, like the ambassador and his secretary. Next thing you know, there's 10 or 15 people down there. And suddenly there's violence going on between the 2 political parties as we approach the election at the end of the year for a new prime minister. So there was a thought, well, after Marley was shot, the thought was that the CIA had, in fact, infiltrated Jamaica, was trying to disrupt the election, and also at that time, in the previous years, there had been a lot of foreign assassinations by the CIA, taking out various leaders. So Bob Marley wanted to bring both sides together in peace. He wasn't political or favoring one side or the other. He just didn't like the fact that the Democratic Socialists and the conservative parties were warring. And I mean, literally warring, because there were a lot of weapons being used.
Yeah, they had their own posses, right?
Yeah, they had their own posses. And at the same time, he went to the prime minister and said, I want to give this concert. And the prime minister said, yeah, sure, no problem. But he put his name, or the prime minister, by virtue of the prime minister, we present this concert. So he made it look like Bob Marley was for him and trying to get people to go to the concert. This guy, the prime minister, thought that would make him look good and help with the election. But in fact, it kind of put Marley into the crosshairs. And so, as you said, these gunmen stormed into his home, shot up the place. All of the Wailers escaped, but Bob was hit, his manager was hit, and his wife Rita was hit. They went to the hospital. Now, throughout most of this time, Bob had a PR guy from his record label, Jeff Walker, who was with him most of the time. So the question that people wanted to know was, well, did these CIA agents who were posing as diplomats try to kill Bob Marley? And so one of the things I did was I dug in and found the original classified CIA documents that mentioned Bob Marley at this time. I also was able to locate President Gerald Ford's, they get summaries of each country and what's going on, and so his summaries with respect to Bob Marley. And once I got those records, I did find that each of the CIA agents sent down there, it had their real name, then it had their fake diplomatic title, and then it had their real title with the CIA. So I found one of those agents, and I was able to locate him, call him up, and interview him on this whole issue. I also talked to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who had become a national security advisor later under President Reagan. But he told me that he interviewed President Ford about what was going on in all the countries, including Jamaica at the time. I interviewed Jeff Walker, who was with Marley. And the real key that comes into this conspiracy is a gentleman named Carl Colby. He had been hired by Marley's record label to film this particular concert that Bob wanted to put on. And Jeff Walker, the PR man, explained that the reason for filming this particular concert was because Bob wasn't going to be touring for a while, and they could get it onto those late-night rock shows that used to play on Saturday nights very late, where you'd see film clips of rock stars performing, and maybe Saturday Night Live. So that's why they wanted to film. Well, they hired Carl Colby, who was a young man who had gone to college and had gone to film school. But it turns out that Carl Colby was the son of William Colby, who had been the head of the CIA. So you can see how people start to put these things together because they can't explain any other way. Like Bob Marley could not have died of cancer. I'm sorry. This guy was down there, so it had to be. So my job was to go through the actual hit or gunman coming into the house, compare that to the actual CIA books or manuals that tell you how these things take place, how they're supposed to take place. I also learned about whether or not the CIA would ever assassinate a person who was powerful but not in power in terms of an elected position. So I wanted to know that. And then, believe it or not, there was a alleged second attempt where a conspiracy theorist said that Carl Colby was at the hideout where Bob Marley was for 2 days, recovering from his gunshot wound, trying to decide whether or not to go down and play. And at this time, allegedly, Carl Colby gave him a pair of soccer shoes as a gift. And when Bob put his toe into the soccer shoes, it cut his big toe. And as many people know, Bob's cancer that he ultimately died of did start in his big toe and spread to his whole body. But when I looked at some of the facts that this person presented, for example, this conspiracy guy said that the Wailers were there rehearsing. Well, the Wailers had scattered like the wind. They were not at this place, and that was confirmed by Jeff Walker. So there's, just things that didn't add up. And Jeff Walker said, I was with Carl Colby the whole time. We all knew he was the son of the CIA director. And he said, we all had parents that had done things. We all knew about it. We all laughed about it. And I said, did Bob Marley know that Carl Colby was the son of a CIA director? And he said, yeah, Bob knew too. We all knew. And he said, Carl Colby was the only cameraman brave enough to go down to the stage and start filming the concert. And it starts with a single shot because he's the only cameraman. The others were afraid that they'd be sitting targets, just as, of course, Bob Marley was. And in fact, Bob did not get on stage with the Wailers right away. He had some other backup band that happened to be playing that night, and they backed him up on his songs. So there's just a lot of things where you have to take what you're given by conspiracy theorists and then look through each thing and see where are the facts and where do they lead us.
We should point out Bob Marley performed that concert despite still having a bullet lodged in his elbow.
Right. Not only that, if listeners want to see that show, most of it is all contained on YouTube, and they can find it there.
So did you get any answers as to who may have been responsible? Was it the posse loyal to Edward Seaga, who was Prime Minister Michael Manley's political rival?
Well, I got a lot of answers to a lot of these questions, but I think it'd be best to leave it to the readers to
absolutely.
What I found.
All right, let's grab a quick call here. John is in Wisconsin on the wild card line. Go ahead, John.
I'm going to have a quick question for Richard and then a comment for Jim. Richard, I so thoroughly enjoyed the opening of your show when you describe people in different phases or places they've been. Richard, in 1975, I graduated from my high school, and for the next couple of years, I lived in my parents' basement. I had an electric fireplace, and I had a wall hanging with the dogs playing poker. So when you say that, when you're on, it just brings back such warm memories. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Jim, thank you for all the work you have done. Congratulations on your success. I remember like it was yesterday, February 9th, 1964. I was 7 years old. My grandmother was over, and along with my parents and my sister, we watched the Ed Sullivan Show, which we did every week. All of a sudden, when the Beatles were introduced, my parents and my grandmother started laughing. And they said they look funny, they sound funny, they act funny. And I was confused. I was very confused. I just did not get it. Well, fast forward, we eventually all loved the Beatles, the British Invasion, and the decades of great music from the many artists that followed. Jim, my question is, our good classic rockers now are passing away regularly because they're well into their 70s and then some. I'm just wondering, what do you see the future of rock and roll? And by that I mean, the traditional, the drummer, the three guitarists, perhaps a keyboardist. Have we seen that era gone by, Jim, or is there any hope that will return one day?
Thanks, John. Great question.
Yeah, thanks for your call and your kind words. I do think that we will not likely see another resurgence of rock and roll as it was with the 3-4 guitars, maybe keyboard and drums. I think that the last time we saw that was really the 90s with alternative rock, Smashing Pumpkins, Nirvana, Garbage, and many others. But I don't see it. I'm seeing a lot of kids are creating music on computers, in their own bedrooms now, and the computers have come so far now, software and such, that they can create all these sounds, but to the ears of us old classic rockers, it doesn't sound natural. It doesn't sound organic. There's nothing like being near a stage and having someone strum the guitar and just feel the vibration and hear it. There's nothing like a real drum sound versus one that's done with a keyboard. Even though there are some rock bands, some new young rock bands that I think are pretty interesting, I don't know. I don't think there's going to be this whole resurgence of rock and roll as a genre as we knew it.
Just hold on to your vinyl and remember and cherish it. The Beatle Who Vanished. That's going to be made into a movie. Yeah.
So just a quick blurb on that. The Beatle Who Vanished is really the first historical account of Jimmy Nicol, and he was an unknown drummer whose journey from really humble beginnings to saving the Beatles' first world tour was only one part of his legend. Though those 13 days of fame made headlines for him, the true mystery of Nicol is a story riddled with blacklisting, betrayal, drugs, divorce, bankruptcy, and an eventual disappearance that led many to question whether he is dead or alive. And so, again, that's another big mystery I dug into. The British indie film company called ECOS is currently has the rights, and it's the movie is in development. They're working on screenwriting, and I'm very excited. It's something that I'm doing with Alex Orbison, the son of Roy Orbison, and Ashley Hamilton, who's the son of
Rod Stewart?
George Hamilton, yeah.
George Hamilton. Ah, right. Stepson, I think, of Rod Stewart, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Ah, well, I'm looking forward to that as well. Jim, great speaking with you again. Those 2 hours flew by. We'll have to do it again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. It's such a pleasure to speak with you. You're a great host, but also you're a real rock and roll aficionado, so I really enjoy our chats.
Likewise. Jim Berkenstadt, the rock and roll detective. Thank you again. All right. When we come back, the mystery of Atlantis solved? That's straight ahead on Coast to Coast. Welcome back. Well, we were hoping to unravel the mystery of Atlantis with David Edward, former U.S. Army veteran and counterterrorism expert, engineer. Has a resume. It would take me half the show just to go through his resume. But he's also the author of a new book, basically explaining or offering all the evidence as to where Atlantis is and the fact that, yes, it did exist. And David is not with us at the moment. Maybe he's off looking for Atlantis, but perhaps sometime over the next 2 hours, we will finally connect with David Edward. Would love to talk to him again. In the meantime, you, me, and the telephone, open lines. And I thought, coming off that wonderful conversation with Jim Berkenstadt, rock and roll mysteries, and reminiscing about supergroups from the 1960s, and then we talked about the Traveling Wilburys, and so many great musicians have left us this year, over the last couple of years. I thought it might be fun to talk about your brushes with greatness. They don't have to be rock stars. They don't have to be musical legends. It could be anyone, really, who's has celebrity status. So why don't we do that in anticipation, hopefully, of connecting with David Edward and talking about Atlantis? Sound like fun? I think so. Let's do that right after these on Coast to Coast AM. All right, looks like we're going to do open lines, at least for the next little while. And I thought we could pick it up where we left off with Jim Berkenstadt. Well, sort of. The rock and roll detective. Maybe you wanted to talk about some great rock and roll mysteries. We can do that as well. I'm not sure if you know, I used to have a podcast called The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. I guess I did about 40 episodes. It was done in kind of a I was going to say rockumentary, documentary style. And it was a lot of work, and I was very proud of it. And I partnered with Chris Jericho. He had a podcast network of his own, and he's a terrific interviewer, by the way. Not just a wrestler and a rock star in his own right. He has a band called Fozzy. But so I have done a little bit of research into some of these rock mysteries. And that was a project that I was initially to partner with the late R. Gary Patterson. We were going to launch that as a syndicated radio show, or we had hoped to, when he passed suddenly back in 2017. So I launched it as a podcast instead. Anyway, why don't we begin? Do we still have Jim in Delaware, east of the Rockies? Jim, are you there? Hey, Jim.
I'm here, Richard.
Hi, go ahead.
No, my the brush is rock and roll related. I heard Fire by Hendrix on a Philadelphia station that had what they called the Marconi experiment on FM when rock and roll album rock came on FM. And I heard Hendrix for the first time do the song Fire from Are You Experienced? Well, so now I want to see him at his craft. We so happened to be in New York City. I was 13 years old. It was New Year's Eve, 1969. Where was he then? He was at. They released the whole album on CD, Band of Gypsy. So we're there to see the ball come down. Somebody came up to our group and said, "Guess who's at the Fillmore East?" Who? Hendrix. I said, "Come on, let's go. This is my chance." And you know he died the following year on September 18th. Right?
Right. Just after performing at the Isle of Wight. Or did he perform at the Isle of Wight? He was supposed to.
Oh, yeah, he did do that. Yeah. I got the liner notes of Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull on his live Isle of Wight show where Hendrix was. And he talked about Hendrix in the liner notes like if he had lived, we probably would have did a collaboration together.
Can you imagine? That would have been something.
Imagine if these guys lived. Yeah? All kinds of good stuff.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, taken too soon. Jim, appreciate the call. Thank you. I'm trying to remember. Oh, it was Jimi Hendrix road manager at the time, James Tappy Wright. He had written a book, and he believed that Hendrix was murdered, that it was not an accidental overdose or a misadventure or whatever you want to call it when Hendrix died in near London, England in 1970. He was convinced that Hendrix, James Tappy Wright was his road manager, but his actual manager, Mike Jeffrey, who was apparently former MI6 or MI5, and James Tappy Wright claimed that Mike Jeffrey confessed to him that he had Jimi Hendrix killed because their contract was about to expire. And Jimi Hendrix was Mike Jeffrey's moneymaker. Basically, he was all he had. And that Hendrix had made it known that he was not going to renew the contract. And supposedly Mike Jeffrey was in huge financial trouble. He had borrowed a lot of money, supposedly from the mob. Now, this is not my opinion, and Mike Jeffrey is no longer with us either. He disappeared in a mysterious plane crash. But that was James Tappy Wright's theory, that Mike Jeffrey had Jimi Hendrix taken care of, shall we say. Let's see. Who are we going to go to next? Let's say hi to Tim is in Culver City. Hey, Tim, good morning. Welcome to, or I should say good evening. It's still, no, it's morning in California. Good evening, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm well. How are you? I wanted to tell you that Band of Gypsies, before I tell you my quick story, Band of Gypsies is my favorite live album in the world ever.
Mm.
And Jimmy's playing was getting so sophisticated. You know, he didn't play any of those except for like Machine Gun. He played a couple, but most of them were like kind of like soul songs, you know? And it was just, to me, it's such a great record. And anyway, I used to be an O operator about 100 years ago. You know, and you just have to dial O for the operator for long distance.
Oh, yes.
And you will remember, Richard, the Arms concert, which was for MS, supporting Ronnie Lane of the Faces, because he was, you know, he had that disease. And
right,
so
right.
Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page, and which incidentally, Jimmy Page played Stairway to Heaven, just the song by itself, no vocal. But as an O operator, I was in the San Fernando Valley, and so at nighttime I worked graveyard. They had all these, you know, we got a lot of stuff channeled to us. So in those days, you had to call the operator to make an international call, and he was calling Windsor, and he didn't say, "This is Jimmy Page." He said, "I'm going to call so-and-so person to person from Page." But I had seen the Arms concert #1, and I know that they all stay at the Westwood Marquee, or if they did at that time, a lot of you know, music people, and so I broke every rule in the book. I think this is long enough now I can tell it. I listened to the call, as operators could do in those days. I listened to the call, and then since I had the number, when they hung up, when I went on my break, I didn't worry about calling his room back because, you know, they're obviously not going to bed that early. And he, sure enough, he answered the phone, and I told him, you know, without trying to gush, you know, I told him that his music, was the reason that I played guitar, and, you know, I just said a couple things, and he goes, "Is that it?" And I said, "Yeah." And then that was the end of the call. And I got to tell you, if I could squeeze in one more, you know, the mothers of invention were only in it for the money.
Frank Zappa and the Mother of Inventions. Yes. Okay.
Where they're dressed in drag, and in the middle, I forget what song it is, but between songs, Frank says, "Can you call?" And he only gave the 7-digit number, not with the area code. He goes, just like this, "Can you call?" And he gives the number out. So one day I tried it, and I lived in the San Fernando Valley, actually in San Fernando. I dialed the number, and this girl answers like, "Who the heck are you? Hello?" And sure enough, it was Vicky, or Victoria, his wife. And I told her what I did. I mean, I think they planted this to do that. He goes, "You want to talk to Frank?" And so she hands him the phone, and he says, "Where do you, you know, a couple things, how I ended up doing this." And he goes, "Where do you live?" And I said, "Actually in Sylmar, not San Fernando." And that was it. Then just a beat, and then the girl goes, "See you later, man," and hung up. It was really interesting.
That's a great story, Tim. Two great stories.
And thank you so much. I love hearing you're one of my favorite guests.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I appreciate that. An O operator. That's gone the way of the pin setter in bowling alleys. That was a job. And I guess, working at the rotissemat. They should bring those back. Rotissomats. Do you remember those? All right. Let's say hi to, where are we going next? Ben is in the Keystone State, Pennsylvania. Ben, good morning. Welcome to Coast.
Hello, Richard. Two things
Hi there.
real quick. When the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show, my grandmother was in the living room with us, and she said, "Look how silly they are. They'll never be anything."
Yeah. Famous last words.
And then one other thing, I think that Grand Funk Railroad's version of "Give Me Shelter" kicks butt on the Stones version.
I haven't heard that. I didn't know they did that. They did a version.
Yeah, it's on Survival.
Okay.
The album cover has them dressed up as cavemen.
Okay, I have to be honest with you. I'm not that familiar with GFR. I'll have to look into that. Thanks for the tip. I love cover versions. I love comparing cover versions. Sometimes you're left to wonder, well, why did they bother to redo that song? They basically replayed it note for note, and other times it's a total reimagining of the song, and it can work or it can't work. And then sometimes you have a version that just completely blows away the original. I'm trying to think of the Johnny Cash version of "Hurt." Is that who did "Hurt"? Is that not Nine Inch Nails? Thank you, Mike. Yeah, Nine Inch Nails. Nine Inch Nails now say that's Johnny Cash's song. That's not ours anymore. I mean, he totally owns that with his cover. And I think Joe Cocker, some of his covers are just, definitive, totally reimagines the songs. All right. Let's see. Where are we going next? Let's say hi to, on the wild card line, David is in my capital city of Ottawa, or as Tucker Carlson calls it, Ottawa.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Hey, David, welcome.
Listen, I got some good news and some bad news. Let me give you the bad news first. For all the people who ruined their needles trying to do the backwards master thing on the White Album to get the Paul's Buried stuff, if you go to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you go to Strawberry Fields Forever, and that really weird music mashup near the end, just play it forward, but about halfway between 45 and 33. You very distinctly hear Paul is buried. Don't have
Paul
to
is
your
buried.
needles.
Okay, that's good to know. That's the good news. What's the bad news?
No, that's the good news. The bad news is I feel sorry for those guys who wrecked their needles.
Me too. David, great call. Thank you for that.
Richard.
All right, bye-bye now. Joe is in Monterey, California. Hey, Joe, welcome to Coast.
Thank you for taking my call, Richard.
My pleasure.
I used to be on the air for 9 years, a 15-minute show, WOR out of New York, and one of the guests that I interviewed was Hans Holzer. He was a notary, a very known person in the ESP, paranormal field, all that stuff. He used to write books and stuff. He was very interesting. And at the station, we'd have people come in and out, and there were some interesting people. Joey Reynolds.
Joey Reynolds show. Wasn't he a talk show host?
Excuse me?
Joey Reynolds, was he a talk show host? No, I'm thinking of Joey Franklin.
Yes,
My apologies.
And he was inducted in the Music Hall of Fame a long time ago, and he had a show overnight. And Joe Franklin, who passed away, by the way.
Yes.
He was a great person, wonderful person to meet. Let's see, Joan Rivers.
You met Joan Rivers?
She was interesting, very hyper, very, very quick. And she had a show at night. And I was there with a friend, and we were going to interview someone at nighttime to tape. This was taped, by the way. So, the only time the person that I was going to interview would come at night because she had a day job. But it was interesting to meet some of the people work there and the guests that they would come in. But what's really interesting is my nephew. He writes for Den of Geek, and he interviews people in the music industry, and then some. He had an interview with William Shatner.
Oh, yes.
Excuse me?
I said, oh, yes, I'm listening.
Yeah. I met him on the plane, getting on a plane, and it was interesting to have everybody, wait for me to finish talking to William Shatner. But,
right. Hard to believe he's 90 years old, William Shatner. He's just so full of life and always looking to take on, new challenges and just has such a a zeal and a zest for life. Joe, thank you for the call. I think we can squeeze in one more before we break at the bottom of the hour here. Let's say hi to Walter is in Graham, Washington. Walter, welcome to Coast. Good morning.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, my brush with greatness, I got to jam with Buddy Miles for an evening after a gig he did in Tacoma, Washington. And it was just a small club. And after the gig, I was with another guitar player, and he had a house that the band practiced in. And he says to Buddy says, well, where's the party? And he says, well, come on with us. And Buddy says, okay. And so we went to this house, and there was a Hammond B3 and guitars and whatnot. And Buddy spent the night in drum sets, and Buddy spent the night playing every instrument except the drums. And I was just playing an acoustic pan guitar, and we just kind of did jamming all night long for a few hours. And then at the end, Buddy says, well, I'm going to take you guys with me. He had a small motorhome, and he says, I want you to go on the road with me and this other guitar player. And we were kind of freaked out. You know, we didn't know what he was saying it for. And so at the end of the night, we says, well, we're going to walk up to this store up here, this little 7-Eleven, and get some cigarettes. So Buddy didn't say anything, and we walked out. We came back about 10 minutes later, and Buddy's standing by the door, and he goes, you guys left me to go get cigarettes? You left me? And he says, I'm out of here. And he gets in his motorhome and takes off. But anyway, that was it. But there's one other thing too. Maybe.
Well, but I gotta jump in because I'm out of time here. I gotta move into the bottom of the hour break here. But thank you for that great call, Buddy Miles. He played with Jimi Hendrix in Band of Gypsies, so we're tying it all together. Welcome back. NASA successfully hot-fired a full-scale rotating detonation rocket engine for nearly 10 minutes. The new rocket engine uses a supersonic combustion phenomenon known as a detonation to generate thrust and can create more power while burning less fuel than traditional propulsion systems. The hardware that make up the new engine design was, get this, 3D printed and showed it could operate for extended time under extreme conditions caused by the detonations. Scientists think the new fuel-efficient rocket technology will allow future spaceflight vehicles to visit deep space destinations like Mars. You can check out the video in the highlight carousel up at coasttocoastam.com. Back with more of your brushes with greatness and your thoughts on rock and roll mysteries right here on Coast to Coast AM. All right, a bit of an impromptu open lines tonight. We will try and reschedule David Edward to talk about Atlantis. Not sure what happened. We hope he's well. However, we're kind of using my earlier conversation with the rock and roll detective Jim Berkenstadt as a launching pad. We were discussing rock and roll mysteries and just, kind of riffing on rock and roll and classic rock in general. So your brushes with greatness, they don't have to be musical legends, but they could be. But also maybe you want to kick around some rock and roll mysteries. It's something I know a little bit about, having produced and hosted a podcast called The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone once upon a time. Let's say hi to Gordon is in Lakeland, Florida. Gordon, good morning and welcome to Coast.
Hey, long time no see. As a perfect segue between your previous guest and your next guest, did you hear the latest theory about the disappearance of Elvis?
The latest theory? No, enlighten me.
Well, the one where he's picked up by an ET on the UFO and is at Atlantis. Did you hear about that one?
No, I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, well, neither have I, but I just couldn't resist. We love you, man. I couldn't resist. God bless.
Appreciate it. God bless you, Gordon. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Let's see. Who are we going to next? It's Todd in Seattle, Washington. Hey, Todd. Welcome to Coast.
Thank you here, sir. Now, I had a brush with Mr. Christopher James DeGarmo of Queensryche, and he's the one who told me that the song I Dream in Infrared is about being obsessed with dreaming, and That song is on the Rage for Order album, which is their second album. And they had a song called I'm Gonna Get Close to You by Lisa Del Bello, who is a Canadian artist. And I would like to talk about a couple songs on this album.
Okay.
Okay, now, Screaming in Digital is a song I think is about this idea of these billionaires, downloading their brain or freezing their brain and basically going insane, through their, trying to preserve themselves. And the song Nuit Regal is about a alien landing, and it talks about hailing the arrival of a distant wanderer. And the song I Will Remember talks about an orbit survey. Find Your Mind. It's talking about a distant survey, basically, a distant satellite surveying your mind. And the more popular song by Queensryche, which is a sequel to I Dream in Infrared, is Silent Lucidity. And that song says, if you open your eyes to me, you won't, I think it says, if you open your mind to me, you won't rely on open eyes to see. And Chris DeGarmo's the man who wrote all this stuff, and it talks so much about the stuff that's talked about every night on Coast to Coast AM. And I was just curious what you think about Christopher James DeGarmo.
Well, I'm not familiar, really. I've heard the name Queensryche, but I'm not familiar with I've never sat down and actually listened. But you've intrigued me, Todd. Maybe it's time that I do, just based on the lyrics there that you've described. Yeah, maybe he's a coast-to-coast fan. It sounds like he could be. Thank you for that. Let's say hi to Scott in Chicago. Hey, Scott, good morning. Welcome to Coast.
Hey, hello, Richard. I love you, and I love your program. You're a great presenter.
Thank you so much.
Where would you like? Well, I'd just like to say, my point of view, I like Johnny Cash and his redistribution of Depeche Mode's Your Own Personal Jesus.
Yes, that's a good one.
Hop to Jimmy. Yeah, he did a humdinger there. And I'd also like to say I prefer Molly Hatchet's remake of the song Dreams as opposed to the Allman Brothers. And I'm a pot-smoking hippie, which brings me back to brother Jimi Hendrix. I'm from and I'd like to say I am not a conspiracy theorist. I am a conspiracy enthusiast. I believe Jimi Hendrix was worth a lot more. Regretfully, I say this with regrets, and I don't mean harm to anybody. This is just my own personal opinion based on what I've read and I heard. I believe that whoever he was murdered, he's worth a lot more money than he was dead. We got the report back that said, I can remember in grade school, people coming to school and saying, yeah, Jimi Hendrix threw up on his puke, man. He was drunk or tripping on acid, and he threw up on his puke.
Aspirate. Well, yeah, it's called aspiration. Yeah.
They filled his. Well, then explain this doozy. His lungs were filled to capacity. He was drowned. His lungs were filled to capacity with red wine.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
That's like a CIA night thing. And I'm not saying the CIA killed him. I'm just saying I don't believe at all that he accidentally overdosed. That don't fly in my book. And so thanks for giving me time. I love your program, and I could talk to you forever, brother.
All right. Well, another time. You call another time. Scott, great talking to you. Yeah, I'd heard supposedly the ER physician, I guess when they brought Hendrix into the hospital, was it Harrowsmith in England? Was it Mayfair? Anyway, it was a suburb of London. And the emergency doctor supposedly said that his lungs, that he had wine basically coming out of his mouth and his nose. And people that knew Hendrix said, well, he never drank red wine. So there's that. And as to the being worth more dead than alive, well, I suppose you could make that argument about many famous people who are insured. And in the case of Jimi Hendrix, I guess he would have been insured I believe he was insured not only by Mike Jeffrey, but also by the record label at the time. So unless you believe that the record label was involved, I'm not saying one way or the other that, that he was or he wasn't murdered. I think there's some pretty compelling evidence that there was something else going on there that we, that doesn't necessarily align with the official narrative. But unless you believe the record company was in on it as well, I mean, in order to collect the life insurance. But the red wine is interesting. And then again, you have James Tappy White. Now, he's no longer with us. Was he just trying to sell books? Because he claims that Mike Jeffrey confided in him that he killed Jimi Hendrix. We'll never know, I don't think. I don't think we'll ever know. Scott, thank you for the call. Let's see. Let's say hi next. We're going to go to Winston-Salem, and Jim. Jim, you're on Coast to Coast. Good morning.
Good morning. At the time this took place, I was living in Tennessee, just outside of Knoxville. And I had been a fan of Gary Patterson for some time. I'd heard him on a station when I lived in North Carolina. And he was a guest on Coast. I called in, spoke with him. And as they announced where you're calling from, he told me his daughter lived there and that I should email him and we would get together. And sure enough, although I didn't believe it would happen, I sent him an email and he sent me his cell phone number. And we went out. He signed my book, Take a Walk on the Dark Side. And I was able to converse with him for the rest of his years. I wouldn't say we were best friends, but at least he would accept my phone calls when I called him. He also introduced me to one of my favorite radio programs, The Conspiracy Show.
Yeah, Gary was a good friend, and everything that you're telling me that sounds exactly like Gary. That's just the type of person that he was, and his word was his bond. If he said he was going to email you or call you, or that you could call him, that's the way it was. And I miss him. Jim, thank you for sharing.
He was a walking encyclopedia. I mean,
oh yes, he was.
Anything that was in his book, he knew that information cold.
Yes. I mentioned earlier he loved to talk about all of the clues on all the Paul is Dead clues on Sgt. Pepper's the cover, and he would call me. We would talk off the air. I mean, he was on my radio program many times, but we would just talk off the air, and I'd get him going. I'd say, "What about this clue? What about that clue?" And he'd talk all night if you let him. Miss him. Jim, thank you so much. Pete is in North Carolina. Pete, welcome to Coast.
I dig the show. I think you do a better rock and roll show than Ian Ponnet does.
Oh, now he's pretty darn good.
But tell you my little brush with greatness here when I met B.B. King. And, the guy mentioned Hendrix, him and B.B. King were actually on a stage one time together. And B never liked his version of Rock Me Baby, but the story goes like this. I met B in Central Park, and the great show. And anyway, after the show's over, we decided to sit it out for a little bit because we want to fight the traffic getting out of Central Park. And about 20 minutes later, the roadies pull in and start taking the equipment off the stage. My buddy goes, "Look, there he is." B.B. King had changed clothes, and he's out talking to the roadies on the side of the truck. So in about a second, there's like 15 kids around him talking to B.B. King, My buddy even bums a cigarette off him. And anyway, the conversation goes, they were talking about guitars that he had custom made, him and Bo Diddley had made over the years, and they got stolen in transit, So whenever they fly or whatever, they always keep their axe with them, So I jokingly, I says to B, I said, "Well, B, why don't you write a blues song about your guitars being stolen?" And he put his cigarette out and looked me dead in the eye, and he says, "Well, damn, that'd be an open invitation for him to come steal them, wouldn't it?"
Great story. Thank you, Pete.
Hey, I want
Appreciate
to ask
it.
you one other thing. Somebody had told me Ronnie Hawkins, one of your Canadian rockers up there,
yes,
had passed away a couple of years. I did not know this. And
last year, 2022, yes.
That must have been one heck of a funeral, but people came in from all over the world for that.
A good friend of mine was good friends with Ronnie Hawkins, and he, I'm trying to remember who he said was there, whether Neil Young was there, I think, and Gordon Lightfoot was there. I can't remember. Maybe some members of the band, whether it was Robbie Robertson or Garth Hudson, I think may have joined. Oh, just kind of like a Zoom, like it was a memorial. It wasn't an actual funeral. It was more of a celebration of life. But yeah, that would have been something to see. Thank you so much for the call. Let's see. Carl is in Kitchener, Canada. Hey, Carl, welcome.
Good morning. Someone mentioned Johnny Cash there earlier. He came to Kitchener a couple of times. When they came out with the Johnny Cash machine, was a concert there at our center in the square. And the second time he came we had the Lulu's there, the world's biggest bar.
I've been there, yes.
Concert. Yeah. Sorry. Halfway through the concert, I shared his testimony about becoming a Christian, getting back on track as a Christian. If he was still alive, you'd probably get him on Coast to Coast like Pat Boone. He was just as famous as Pat Boone and Elvis one time.
Sure. Yes, he was. And, part of the $1 Million Trio. Is that what they called him? The $1 Million Trio? Him
I didn't know that.
Elvis and Carl Perkins.
Anyways, I met Boris Spassky, world champion at chess there, up North Bay International Chess Tournament. He was promoting the tournament. He didn't play in it back in 1995. He met Spassky in 1973 in Iceland, and they had the big match there. He got
Bobby Fischer, you mean? Boris Spassky played Bobby Fischer in Iceland. Yeah,
the height of the Cold War there up in Iceland. That was a big thing, and then Bobby Fischer beat him in chess and became world champ. But then he dropped out of chess, and actually I asked Boris Spassky what the problem was with Bobby Fischer, and he said the man's still a mystery. But when the Iron Curtain came down, some documents came out. Like Bobby Fischer said the KGB were following him, but it was true. The KGB were shadowing him at the time, I guess, to kind of psych him out a bit. And they didn't want an American keeping the title as chess champion, because it usually was a Russian who was world champion at chess.
Yeah, I remember that chess match in Iceland when I was in grade school, and that was like the year after the Canada-Russia summit, the 72 series, when we played hockey against the Russian Red Army team. And so then the next year, it was Spassky versus Bobby Fischer. So that, I mean, it wasn't, for us Canadians, it wasn't as big a deal, but I had friends who were into chess, and for them it was a huge deal. I don't know if people are aware, but Russell Targ, of course, is many times on Coast to Coast. His brother-in-law was Bobby Fischer. All right. Do I have time for another? I don't think I can squeeze in another one before the break. I'm going to share very quickly a Jimi Hendrix story that was told to me by James Tappy Wright, his former road manager. Jimi Hendrix used to play with Little Richard. I believe it was Little Richard, was it? Yes, it was Little Richard. Anyway, there was a benefit concert in the Village in New York, and Jimi Hendrix, or the Little Richard was there, and the manager of the theater told each act, "You only have 15 minutes. 15 minutes, that's it. You know, we've got a schedule to keep here." So one band comes on, they play their 15 minutes, the crowd cheers, they get off, the next band comes on. Now it's Little Richard's turn. 15 minutes come and go. Do you think he's going to get off the stage? So he says to the audience, "Do you want to hear more?" And of course, the audience shouts yes. And so Little Richard keeps playing. Well, James Tappy Wright says that one of the people that worked at the theater is instructed to unplug, I guess, the microphone or the amplifier. So they're doing that. Little Richard sees what they're doing, runs off stage, and tackles the person that's trying to unplug his amp. And who do you think is pulling Little Richard off of everybody? Jimi Hendrix. All right, we'll take a quick timeout. Top of the hour, actually. And when we come back, more of your fabulous calls. These are great calls tonight. Thank you. Open lines continue on Coast to Coast. Hey, welcome back. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Serrett and the website strangeplanet.ca. Hey, it's time to look up to the sky over the next week as a rare comet, last seen over 5,000 decades ago, is set to pass near the planet. The harmless comet known as C2022 E3ZTF, or Green Comet. You know, I keep saying this. They got to come up with more, more inspiring names or romantic names for these celestial bodies, as Comet C2022 E3ZTF, or Green Comet for short. Anyway, it was last seen during the Stone Age more than 50,000 years ago, a time when Earth experienced an ice age and when mastodons and saber-toothed cats roamed the planet. KTLA sister station KXRM is reporting this. On Thursday, February 2nd, it will pass its closest to Earth again, hurtling between the orbits of Earth and Mars at a relative speed of 128,500 miles per hour. Its nucleus is thought to be about 1 mile across, while its tail extending millions of miles. Green, from all the carbon in the gas cloud or comma surrounding the nucleus, this long-period comet was discovered last May by astronomers using the Zwicky Transient Facility, a wide-field camera at Caltech's Palomar Observatory. That explains its official cumbersome name, Comet C2022 E3ZTF. NASA said the comet was discovered inside Jupiter's orbit. Anyway, you can read more about this comet in the news section. Oh, by the way, the comet is visible to the naked eye in the hemisphere's darkest corners, but at 26 million miles away, the best way is to see it through the telescope or binoculars and in the pre-dawn hours. Again, in the news at coasttocoastam.com. And coming up tonight on Coast to Coast AM, Monday morning into Tuesday, Monday night into Tuesday, James P. Gray has been a trial judge in Orange County, California since 1983 and was the 2012 Libertarian candidate for vice president. He'll join George Norrie to share his thoughts about the generation ahead, as well as updates on the abysmal conditions in U.S. prisons, immigration reform, and school choice. In the second half, George welcomes Coriel Kramer, who's been connecting and speaking with animals since she was a child. That's tonight, Monday night. Tonight's Monday night into Tuesday morning. George Norrie on Coast to Coast AM. All right, back to more of your terrific calls. Open lines continues on Coast to Coast AM right after these. All right, brushes with greatness and rock and roll mysteries and legends. Let's say hi to Frank. He's in Evergreen, Montana. Frank, good morning. Welcome to Coast.
Hi, this is great.
Hi there.
Great show. I wanted to talk about one of the greatest Western singers there ever was. It was Leonard Nimoy.
Really? Mr. Spock?
Yes. He actually did a song of Johnny Cash's version of I Walk the Line. And
really?
He was also a great horseman. He played in a lot of Westerns back in the old days. Before the Final Frontier. He was a frontiersman in black and white videos in those days.
Now, was he recording regularly, or was that kind of a one-off, like a novelty type album, like William Shatner used to record?
Doing this, and he did a lot of good songs, and he was an artist.
Oh.
And, he just had more class than what's his name, Captain Kirk, the Canadian weirdo. Anyway,
obviously you're not a fan of William Shatner. Now, when Leonard Nimoy, because I've not heard him sing, did he talk the song or did he sing it?
He actually sang them.
Oh, I'll have to check that out. I'm sure I can find it on YouTube. Leonard Nimoy singing Johnny Cash's "I Walk the Line." Well, he certainly had that deep voice. I could see where he would be able to sing a song like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, he was very talented, no question. Hey, Frank, great call. Thank you for that. Mr. Spock sings Johnny Cash. All right. Let's see. Let's say hi to John. He's in Ventura, California. Hey, John, welcome to Coast.
Good morning. I want to tell you about something that happened back in 1976, but beforehand, to follow up on a couple of your callers, William Shatner was in San Diego yesterday, and actually he was putting into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I guess, or whatever the fame is for this band called the Cash Cats. These guys do the cover, they do the Johnny Cash's music, and so I thought that was kind of interesting. You were talking about both.
Yes.
William Shatner, and so he actually did something yesterday in San Diego at one of the theaters. Now, for me to tell you about what happened to me back in 76, it's kind of like a full circle. I wanted to give you a picture back in 76, what the lay of the land was and what was happening. So I was, of course, being from Southern California, we hitchhiked to the beach, and so it was real normal. So my brother moved up to Oregon, so I went up there to visit him. And my first day in Oregon, he was going to work, so he dropped me off out in the middle of Grants Pass. It was kind of out that way. And so he had to go to work himself, so he kind of dropped me off. And so I went out to the highway to start hitchhiking. And I kid you not, it's like I kept walking and hiking. A bunch of cars come by. Nobody picked up hitchhikers in Oregon. And finally, after about a good hour and a half of me just walking into town and hitchhiking, finally this, of course, at the time, I heard dogs were in the back of trucks barking at me. You see the gun racks in the back of the trucks. And so you're just going, man, what is this Oregon all about? And the hitchhiking wasn't real popular, so back then at that time. So what happened was an hour and a half, 2 hours later, finally, here I am. I'm 16 years old, and I'm just going there. I want to, just check out Oregon and party and just have a good time. And so finally this girl pulls over in a Mustang, and I go, all right, run up to her, and she's about my age, and I go, wow, this is great. So she takes off, and I go, hey, I said, you want to smoke some pot? And she's going, no, I don't do that. And I go, oh, my God, even the girls are square here. So, again, you got to remember this is in 76. So I said, all I want to do is, just let me out over here. I'll find someone else who wants to party. And she goes, oh, you want to party? He goes, yeah, you can go out to, I don't know which ranch it was. We'll say the Henderson Ranch. And, it's out of town outside this way. And he goes, yeah, there's a band playing out there. I go, yeah, really? What's the name of the band? And they go, the Sticks. And I'm going to myself, I got these, gun racks in the back of pickup trucks, dogs barking at me. Nobody's picking up hitchhikers, some chick that doesn't even smoke pot. And I said, these people are like a bunch of hicks out here. And I said, the group is called Sticks. I could see them playing on a washboard and a big drum. And I'm just saying, no, thank you. So what ended up happening at the end of that summer of 76, I got back into, of course, Southern California, and I found out that the band Sticks had a 3.5-day party, 88 kegs, and I didn't go to that party. And I'm telling you, man, I just kicked myself. So years later, literally, I would say probably 10 years ago, I went to a Sticks band in Ventura at the fairgrounds, and I had at that time really long hair, and I mean, like long hair. And so I just went right front stage, as close as I could get, watching them play the whole time, just jamming out with them. And soon as they were completely done and they walked backstage, I just kind of snuck right back in there real quick and walked back in there. And so I started talking to the guys, and apparently there wasn't as many original folks at the time. But I ended up talking to one of the guys and asked him if he remembered that time, and he was the one who said, oh, no, I'm not one of the originals. So I was just kind of wanting to talk to them to see about those guys and if they can remember when they started back in Oregon and had that big raging party. But when I left, I just went out the normal way, kind of out where I guess we'll say the people were waiting for the band. And I go walking all by myself, and I kid you not, people are asking me for my autograph and stuff like that, and I just go, I'm not one of those guys. I'm not them. And so the other guy said, I don't care. Just give me an autograph. This was so loved. And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right, John, great story. Thank you. With apologies to the fine people of Oregon. All right, let's say hi to Scott is in Costa Mesa, California. Good morning, Scott. Welcome to Coast.
Hey, Richard. Good morning to you.
Hi there.
Hey, yeah, well, my brush with greatness wasn't really a who, but a what. And back in 1992, I was able to travel in a group called Up With People. And it was really quite amazing. For a full year, they took kids from around the world, and my cast, we traveled to 24 states and 8 countries in Europe, and we lived sort of the rock style lifestyle, and it was quite amazing. We stayed with host families, and it was just one of those years that is but a dream almost.
They're still around, aren't they?
They are, but not nearly like they were. They invented the halftime show for football, NFL.
Is that right?
Back in the day. And so anyways, just my brush with greatness was that group called Up With People, and the Caldwell brothers and Herb Allen, who wrote songs for that. And it might not be rock stars, but it was a lot of fun.
Well, and they did a lot of great work, and they do a lot of great work. Scott, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Okay. Do we have time? Yeah, we have time for another one here before the bottom of the hour. Daniel is in Panama City, Florida. Daniel, good morning. Welcome to Coast.
Morning. Hi, Richard. Thank you for the show and this creative way of finessing the Atlantis disappointment.
That's all right. We'll get him back on.
Thanks to all the callers, too. Great stories. Loving it.
Oh, they're fantastic.
Holly Go Lightly, Audrey Hepburn, Moon River, and some of the songs. I'm kind of going to listen to the Lightfoot 1986, the one you played earlier.
Oh, I'll tag along.
Yes. And all the Zen. Thank you for that. Well, I have a story. There's a lot of by the wayside rock and rollers, and when music videos came out in the 80s and like that style of VH1 and MTV and things, like I ended up meeting several different famous people over my lifetime. We'll go with like the music things though. You may have heard of a band called the Spin Doctors, and they have a guitarist, a lot of catchy riffs from Pocket Full of Kryptonite and Two Princes. They were pretty famous and had a tour. I've dated a girl that had dated the guitar player, and when they were doing part of their tour, they were coming through the town I was in, and we got to go VIP and meet the whole band and have a connection with them. I think I was the biggest fan of all, but those guys put on a really good show. They're so much better than what they get known for, and their sort of pop style radio hits. They're pretty aggressive, and their bass player stood out more than all the catchy things I thought I knew. This girl had known Henry Rollins, who's kind of gone into podcasting. He's pretty eloquent and thoughtful. And he had sponsored a band, and she was on MTV giving her middle finger at the end of one of those rock star music videos where this is like the classic lead singer died of an overdose type of thing. But like years and years later, I met her and had so many experiences, and she actually introduced me to the Holly Go Lightly, Audrey Hepburn, Moon River, which is the only one I knew about, right, until, was it
Andy Williams, wasn't it?
Andy Williams, right? Yeah.
Yeah, which is also great, but I love the Audrey Hepburn version. It's because, she's not known as being, a professional singer, and it's just so poignant. When actors sing, I don't know what it is, but it may not be perfect pitch or whatever, but because they're actors, I don't know. It just seems it feels more powerful and poignant to me.
Sure, she was a natural holding the guitar in that acoustic version, and that's the first one I was introduced to with that song. Mm-hmm. And I got goosebumps when you played it there when it came on, and I got to thinking I hadn't listened to it in quite a while now, and got a lot of memories in that song with the girl I dated. She had died too about 10 years ago, and I've lost my vision since then, and I kind of reflect on these things visually.
I'm sorry.
I got a happier story. I mean, you ever heard of a guy named Mick Fleetwood?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so like when I met him, I was staying in this alleyway in the 71 Volkswagen Westfalia Pop Top that needed the motor replaced, and it just kind of sat for a long time. Mick Fleetwood, I'd seen him drive by in his little green Model T Ford that he would drive around this cute little town where he has a restaurant now called Lahaina. And he would drive by and throw me a little wave, and I've seen him several times. Eventually, he walked right up to me. And I found out he had interest in a red coral necklace that somebody was trying to sell. and probably couldn't come to an agreement about it. You know, the owner of the necklace wasn't going to worship the royalty of Mick Fleetwood. But this guy is tall. For those of you that don't know, Mick Fleetwood's very tall. Has a British accent.
Yeah.
And he had to lean down to say hi to me because I'm only 5'8". But, you know, he wanted me to pass a message along to somebody for him to let him know that he wanted to come back. And that's how I subsequently found out that he was interested in this kind of chunky red coral necklace, which they're quite rare. And there's only a few grandfathered in harvesters of the different black and red and other corals in the Pacific Ocean these days. So that's kind of an interesting way. I've met Val Kilmer in this same alleyway and seen Steven Tyler just like a normal guy walk by. But
that's some alleyway.
Really
well, they say you stay in one place long enough and the whole world will pass by.
Right. I mean, it happened to be like that. I mean, Mike Myers opened up a door in a restaurant in the same town and walked out with his longtime wife, right? And I was going to open up the door, I reached for the handle to walk into this cute little waterfront restaurant, about 20 tables or less in it, and when I reach for the doorknob, he opens it up and pulls it and walks right by me, just kind of nonchalant, a little greeting, hello, and just pass right in and have our experience in the restaurant he just enjoyed, right? But yeah.
Is it that all of this happened in Panama City?
No, this happened in a town called Lahaina out in the Pacific Islands of Hawaii.
Okay.
On an island called Maui, and there's a few transient people here in Panama City. I met Mario Ferrari of Ferrari Cars, Dale Earnhardt Jr. looks kind of like me, a little bit shorter. His girlfriend took a double take. I met Emmanuel Lewis. You remember Emmanuel Lewis from?
Oh yes, that's right.
He came in with his entourage. I was 14 years old and working the cashier at a McDonald's restaurant that was just like the old 50s type style of the look with the CD jukebox. They had a CD jukebox in the front where you could play all the songs from B-52s, Janis Joplin, the Eagles, the Coasters, the Platters, all the famous old musicians. I'm kind of drawing a little bit of a blank, but it's really set up with the old shiny red glitter Coca-Cola ice cream sundae type stools and the bar around the window.
Oh yeah,
with his entourage.
Formica tabletops.
Yes, and they had this place really coiffed out, looking super cute and original with a little speedy bolo tie.
Daniel, sorry to cut you off. I gotta run. We gotta move into the break here, but great stories. Thank you so much for sharing, my friend. I hope you'll call again. Ronnie Spector. Does it get any better than this? Does it really get any better than this? I Can Hear Music, the Ronettes, taking us into the break on Coast to Coast AM. Where have these 2 hours gone? I've had a great time. And I hope you have too. Thank you for your calls. And we'll get to more of them in a few moments. Scientists have developed a brain implant that is thinner than a human hair and would allow you to use social media with your mind. Oh, great. Newsflash, still no cure for cancer. Why? Anyway, the highly experimental chip is designed for, well, this is a good thing, paralyzed or mute patients, people with paralysis who cannot use their limbs to communicate via a computer. Well, that's a good thing. But it could also allow healthy people to use social media with the power of their mind alone. It differs from the brain implant created by Elon Musk's company because the procedure is less invasive and the chip sits on the surface of the brain rather than the tissue or in the tissue. The implant is called the Layer 7 cortical interface, and it's a strip of flexible thin film material like a piece of Scotch tape. The strip has electrodes on and has a thickness that is 1/5 of a human hair, which helps it to conform to the brain's surface without damaging any tissue. The implementation is also reversible if patients change their mind. The device has successfully decoded brain signals in animals and Precision, the company behind this, hopes to get FDA approval to test the implant in humans in the next few months. You can read more of this story in the news section up at coasttocoastam.com. All right, back to more of your calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. All right, more of your brushes with greatness and rock and roll mysteries. First time caller, Ron is in Arkansas. Ron, welcome to Coast.
Richard, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I love what you do with the show, and I love your Strange Planet podcast.
Oh, I thank you for that. Thank you, Ron.
Yes, sir. I'm a 1965 baby, so in 1986, I would have been at the advent of turning 21 that summer, and the girl that I was dating at the time and I decided to go to a rock show, And this would have been at the Arkansas State Fair and Livestock Grounds, which housed the old Barton Coliseum.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was the venue that hosted every rock show in the 70s, 80s, up until the 90s. And it was kind of known back then amongst all the rockers that you could go to the back of the building and they had all the cattle gates and chutes. They loaded the cattle in for the livestock shows. And if you climbed these gates, you could get backstage.
Ah.
So, yes, sir. So me being 20 and braver than I was bright, me and my girlfriend go back there, climb the gates, and lo and behold, Connie Hamsey is backstage. Now, she is known worldwide as Sweet, Sweet Connie of Grand Funk Railroad fame.
Ah, right.
Now, she's a character in and of herself, but a young man wandered out, and very amicable, very friendly. His name was Dave Amato. He is the current guitarist for REO Speedwagon, but at the time, he was touring with none other than Ted Nugent.
Ah, okay.
So Dave, very kind, very friendly fella. He got us backstage passes, took us backstage, and I met Ted. And let me tell you what, he's a colorful fella.
Oh, yes, to say the least. Wango Tango.
Man, his language is quite salty. And
Yeah.
He really likes my girlfriend, and he told me so in so many flowery words. And he's, like Mick Fleetwood, he's extremely tall. I'm 5'7", so anytime I said anything, he had to bend way down and basically put his ear to my mouth because he's almost completely deaf. He's very hard of hearing.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, sir. But he was very, very gracious. He told us to welcome ourselves to anything in craft services, and we stood and talked a little bit about hunting in Michigan. And he and Dave peeled off to go watch 38 Special, who was the headliner. And so my girlfriend and I figured we had our Ted Nugent story, so we made ourselves a couple of turkey sandwiches and headed out.
Nice.
I will say this, they were very good turkey sandwiches.
The question is, did Ted Nugent shoot the turkeys with his bow?
I think they came out of a plastic package, so I would surmise that.
Okay. All right. Great call, Ron. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. The Nuge. Let's say hi to Clarence is in San Diego, California. Hey, Clarence, good morning.
Mr. Surratt, thank you
Hi
for
there.
the last few hours.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
It's been wonderful. It's been great. Hey, your bumpers have expanded my musical library.
Ah, wonderful. That's what I shoot for.
I just had a question. Your thoughts, your opinions on Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, as compared to Jimi Hendrix, Page, Clapton, and Beck?
I have to be honest. I know I've heard of Joe Satriani, and I know people often refer to him as a guitarist, that he's incredibly, proficient and talented, but I haven't sat down and really listened to a lot of Joe Satriani. What do you think of that? Do you think less of me now?
No, not at all. Have you ever seen, have you ever seen that movie, it escapes me now, but it's with that actor Macchio and
Ralph Macchio.
Yes,
from the Karate Kid.
Yeah, that guy, and they go down to the Delta.
Crossroads.
That's the movie. Steve Vai has a section in that. Have you ever seen that movie?
I think I have. Yes. I've certainly talked about the Crossroads a lot over the years. The Robert Johnson story.
But you know what? I love your musical knowledge, and giving us.
Oh, I appreciate that, Clarence. I'll have to. I've certainly been negligent in not listening to Joe Satriani. He reminds me of, because now he's got the bald head, and he reminds me of Paul Schaefer, a very talented musician from, I think he's from Thunder Bay, Paul Schaefer. All right. Appreciate the call, Clarence. Let's say hi to Steve is in Pittsburgh. Hey, Steve. Welcome to Coast.
Hi. You really have a lot of knowledge about entertainment. I met B.J. Thomas and an actor named Clifford James, and I'll tell you about him real quickly. But in 1975, my girlfriend and I were in Las Vegas. We had just driven across the desert, checked into a motel, and we saw a billboard. B.J. Thomas was appearing at this little lounge. And we went over there, and there was, he had trouble with drinking and drugs at that time. And we used to see him back east in Syracuse area when he did big shows, at places. Well, anyway, in Vegas, he was doing a little lounge because he couldn't get the big audiences at that time. And there was probably, including my girlfriend and I, 6 people in the lounge. But he came out. He came out, and he did a program that was like for an audience of 10,000, 20,000 people, really. And he sang, and we had a table right next to the little stage there. He shook our hands. We gave him a standing ovation, and we were just crazy. And I shook both of our hands, and he did this show, and his voice was just like on the records. He had a wonderful voice. Well, we went back the next day. He was staying at this big hotel there. He did his show. There were a few more people that day. And he had a bodyguard, a little cowboy-looking dude, and he was staying at that hotel, and he went out a side door and go into the elevators. Well, we followed him through the casino, and he stopped to get cigarettes by the elevator, and we got talking to him and said we were great fans. And he was such a friendly guy. He said, well, if you ever asked us where we were from, and if we ever see him again, try to meet him again. And just a real nice guy. Now, the other
That's a professional. That's a professional, right? 6 people in the house, and he puts on, he just gives it 110%. That's a professional.
After he passed away not long ago, I was reading all these different people that had run into him at the airport or, different places, sort of like we did. And they all said the same thing. He was friendly. He wasn't, trying to get rid of us or anything quickly, anything like that. Yeah, he was fantastic. But Clifford James, a lot of people don't know his name, but he appeared in Superman 2 with, what was that other big movie I'm trying to think of with, anyway, anyway, I met him at a golf tournament in Houston, Texas. They had a tent with free beer for the guys that were playing golf there. So he said, well, it was ending the tournament. He said, we're having a big party at this hotel, Four Seasons Hotel down the road. He said, why don't you meet me in the bar, and we'll go into the main room, and they'll have, free food and booze and all that. So I did meet him in the bar. So we had a few drinks. He liked to drink a lot. But he always played, like I said, he did about 90 movies. And
I think you mean Clifton James. Clifton James.
Yeah, Clifton. And he started out as a school teacher up there in Oregon, I believe, and then he became an actor. But he always played a Southern sheriff, usually. Cool Hand Luke.
Yeah, he was in. Yes, Cool Hand Luke, and he was also in one of the James Bond movies. He played that Southern. Now, which one was that?
Superman 2. Superman.
No, but he was in a James Bond movie, and he played a Southern sheriff.
Yeah.
And of course, he pulls James Bond over, and he says something like, you're a one-man demolition team or something like that.
Yeah. He smoked cigars in his movies, and he did that in person too at the bar that we were at. And he said when he first started out, he was George C. Scott was his roommate in New York City when they were both starting out, and he worked as a security guard until he could get in show business in New York. And he was saying about George C. Scott, he said he was brilliant, but he was crazy at the same time. He put his hand through a glass door and cut his hand, and he had to take him to the ER and get patched up. And but he was a character. Yeah.
Yeah. Live and Let Die. That was the James Bond movie that he was in. He played the Sheriff J.W. Pepper opposite, well, not opposite. He wasn't a co-star, but that was the Roger Moore film, Live and Let Die. Yeah, he was a terrific character actor. Thank you so much for that. Let's see. Let's say hi to Jay in Auburn, California. Hey, Jay, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning. In 1968, I was a young 22-year-old staff sergeant stationed in Korat, Thailand. And I didn't enjoy the GI bars that much, so I would walk around the city out away from everything else. And I found this Thai hotel with a little small bar on the bottom floor. And I used to go there and sit, and a lot of times I'd be the only one there. And I was there one night, and a gentleman came in and wanted to know if he could sit next to me. And he wanted to talk about his son. His son was playing football for Arizona University at the fullback. And the long story short, it happened, here I am, 22 years old, and it happened to be Doc Blanchard, if you know who he is.
Doc Blanchard, no.
Heisman Trophy winner for West Point, 1953.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Inside.
There you go.
At the time, he was the commander of the F-105 wing on Korat. So he was a 22-year-old kid meeting in a small hotel in Bangkok.
Yeah, of all the places in Bangkok, no less. Amazing.
No, not Bangkok, Korat.
Korat. Okay.
Yeah.
Appreciate the call, Jay. Thank you. I think I can work in one more. Let's say hi to Milo, who's in Las Vegas. Milo, good morning. Welcome to Coast.
Well, good morning, Richard. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you.
Back in 2006, I'm a local Las Vegas musician, keyboard player. I was playing at the Hilton in the Hilton band there, actually, for a show called Lunchtime with Ira. And one of the guests was going to be none other than Denny Lane from Paul McCartney and Wings band.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that was he wanted to do Go Now. But we didn't really have time to rehearse it. He kind of just showed up, and I had to, instantly kind of learn this song, So he gave me the tempo. It's kind of an odd song to play because it's in 6/8 meter. So it's kind of like a waltzy kind of doom, 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 you know what I mean? Kind of feel to it, which is odd for a rock song because most rock songs are in 4/4, right?
Right.
So anyway, before the cameras start rolling, we're rehearsing this song, right? So I had the tempo that he wanted, the sounds, everything. Everything was perfect. So we're starting to roll, right? We get introduced and all that. And I start the song, and I played it the exact tempo that he, said he wanted it. So he's making these motions like for me to speed it up right on camera, right? And I thought to myself, I can't do that, in the interest of being professional, I got to keep forging ahead, right? So about a minute or two later into the song, he turns around and he starts smiling at me as if, oh, yeah, this is great. So he changed his mind, right on camera.
Good for you for hanging tough there.
Huh?
Great. I say good for you for hanging tough.
Yeah. Well, I just, I'm a professional musician,
Yes, you are.
I just couldn't understand why he would do that on camera, But anyway, you could see it. Milo plays with Denny Lane on YouTube. And you can see
I'll check it out.
Happening. Yeah.
Hey, Milo,
it turned
great
out
call.
Great.
Thank you
it
for
was
that.
a great track.
I'll check it out. That's awesome. Thank you so much. Great story. All right. Wow. Those 2 hours flew by, and thank you. They flew by because you're such great company, all of you. Thank you, George Norrie, George Knapp, Lisa Lyons, Stephanie Smith, Tom Danheiser, Dan Galante, Chris Burrows, Michael Cosio, Donna Walker, and Lex Lonehood. I'm Richard Serra. Thank you for your ears and your voices, your beautiful voices. Until next time, so long for now.